Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar in the SERDP and ESTCP series. My name is Jennifer Nyman. I'm with Geosyntec Consultants, the coordinator of the webinar on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. The webinar today will consist of a brief overview of SERDP and ESTCP by Dr. Kurt Preston, followed by a list of upcoming webinars in this series. After the opening remarks, we will transition to the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event features presentations on Department of Defense research on longleaf pine ecosystems at military installations. First, Dr. Nina Wurzberger of the University of Georgia will present on fire and biological nitrogen fixation in the ecosystems. Her presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer session. Next, Dr. Joseph O'Brien of the USDA Forest Service will present on mechanistic models for streamlining, monitoring, and informing management. His presentation will also be followed by a brief question and answer session. We will conclude the webinar with a Q&A session with both of our speakers. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions, and in fact, we do encourage you to submit questions in advance of that session. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in case you experience any difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay will be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into that conference line there. However, if you continue to have problems, please submit a comment using the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Kurt Preston, who is the SERDP Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resiliency. Dr. Preston has tracked his career between civilian, university, and military positions. Prior to his current position with SERDP, he was a faculty member and research administrator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he led faculty development efforts to improve research competitiveness. In this position, he also worked with technology transfer personnel, academic departments, and colleges to build university research capability. In addition, Dr. Preston has served as a member of the Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. Kurt?
Thank you, Jennifer, and I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impacts real-world environmental management. The ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs that are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs, with much of SERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, though occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are 4 program areas in SERDP and 5 in ESTCP. The Energy and Water Program area is only in ESTCP, while the other 4, Environmental Restoration, Munitions Response, Resource Conservation and Resiliency, and Weapon Systems and Platforms, are SERDP and ESTC programs managed jointly by a designated program manager. Our webinar today is focusing on research and demonstrations that were conducted under the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area, which has three main areas of research: natural resources, resiliency, and wildland fire. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from each of the 5 program areas. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics, including an overview of chlorinated solvent remediation, improving installation sustainability through informed stormwater impacts, and more. You can find more information about upcoming webinars at this link. Registration is now live for webinars through the end of the year. And I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of this webcast. I am also pleased to announce that the SERDP ESTC Symposium will be held for the second year in a row this upcoming November in Washington, D.C. The 3-day event will showcase the latest technologies that enhance DoD's mission through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration information is available on the SERDP and ESTCP website. Finally, I hope you enjoyed the webinar today.
Thank you, Kurt. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nina Wurzburger, an associate professor in the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia. She is an ecosystem ecologist who studies how nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and molybdenum affect the cycle of carbon. She has an interest in plant-soil relationships, and specifically how microbial symbioses regulate nutrient access to plants and the ecosystem. Her research spans the globe, from tropical forest to Arctic tundra. Prior to her appointment at the University of Georgia, Nina was a postdoctoral associate at Princeton University and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. She earned her master's degree in soil science from the University of California at Davis and a doctorate in forest resources from the University of Georgia. Nina?
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone for being with us today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share some of our research findings with you all, and I'm going to start by first giving you some context for our work and the objectives that we sought to achieve. I'll briefly describe our approach before moving on to the main results that we found. I'm then going to spend some time synthesizing these findings and dig into a new question that our research findings raised. And then I'll describe how our work benefits the DoD and its goals. And after that, we'll have time for questions. So our work was motivated by the fact that fire volatilizes nitrogen, removing it from the ecosystem. If fire is frequent, as it is in longleaf pine ecosystems, it becomes important to know how the nitrogen gets back in. And the main natural way for nitrogen to re-enter the ecosystem is through biological nitrogen fixation. And this is the process where atmospheric dinitrogen gas is reduced to a usable form that is available to plants and microbes. But only certain bacteria can do this process, certain bacteria that associate with plants or other organisms. And while the importance of nitrogen fixation has been acknowledged in the past, especially for longleaf pine systems, there had been no studies to rigorously quantify fixation. So the objectives of our study were to do just that, to quantify nitrogen fixation among the 3 main groups of nitrogen fixers. And secondly, we sought to understand how fire is regulated, by how fixation is regulated by fire and other nutrients to better predict how this process might vary across the landscape. And after quantifying all of the individual components of the nitrogen cycle, we ultimately wanted to know if the nitrogen coming in through fixation balanced the losses from fire. Ecological theory would predict that inputs and losses of nitrogen should balance if an ecosystem is operating at steady state. So our approach was to establish 1 hectare study plots in Sandhill Longleaf pine at Fort Benning and Eglin Air Force Base. We chose sandhills because these are likely to be the most nitrogen limited. We selected plots across a stand age gradient because nitrogen dynamics change over stand age. Nitrogen limitation is typically most severe when stands are young. Our youngest plots were between 1 and 3 years old at the start of the study, and our oldest stand at Eglin was about 225 years old. And I should point out that all of our stands that are less than 25 years old were planted, and the rest were naturally regenerated. We crossed our stand age gradient with another gradient, one of fire frequency, but this was done only among mature stands, where fire frequency ranged from almost annually to over 20 years since the last recorded fire. So in total, we had 59 plots. To quantify fixation, we targeted the 3 major players of fixation. These include herbaceous legumes, which are abundant and diverse in these ecosystems, biological soil crusts, which are conglomerations of algae, lichens, cyanobacteria, and mosses. These persist at the soil surface. And we also looked at asymbiotic or free-living nitrogen fixers, which persist in the litter layer. So we quantified the abundance of these 3 groups on an area basis, and we also quantified their fixation rate using acetylene reduction assays and a calibration technique with isotopically labeled dinitrogen gas. So for legumes, this process entails excavating the root system, finding the nodules, and incubating those nodules. For soil crusts, it involves taking the soil samples back to the laboratory and incubating them under high light and ideal moisture conditions. And for the asymbiotic fixers, it involves taking leaf litter samples and incubating the whole mass of that sample to determine the fixation rate. To understand how nutrients control fixation, we conducted 3 different studies. The first was a greenhouse experiment where we used field soil from our sites, and we selected 7 species of legumes that are common at both of our sites. We applied treatments including nitrogen addition, phosphorus, molybdenum, and a phosphorus and a molybdenum addition. And we did this to see how the legumes responded to the additions of these various nutrients. We then conducted a field study where we applied nitrogen and phosphorus individually to a subset of our plots to examine how legumes and trees responded. And third, we assessed the ambient levels of soil nitrogen and phosphorus to examine any relationships between those variables and with the rates of nitrogen fixation that we quantified. To quantify the nitrogen cycle, we measured tree growth and nitrogen demand by taking annual DBH measurements and height measurements. We sampled tissues for nitrogen concentrations and applied those to estimates of biomass from allometric equations. We quantified understory vegetation biomass nitrogen and leaf and root production using litter traps and root ingrowth cores. To quantify the nitrogen loss from fire, we sampled the organic horizon before and after a fire event to determine the mass of the O horizon and also its total nitrogen content. We also quantified the nitrogen in the understory plants that are typically consumed in fires. And over our study period, there were 73 fire events across our individual plots that allowed us to estimate these nitrogen losses. So what did we find? Let's first start by looking at nitrogen fixation. This is a rate expressed in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And what we found was surprisingly low rates. We also found a large difference between our sites in terms of fixation rate, with rates being much higher at Benning versus Eglin. And this difference was driven primarily by the legumes. So legumes are abundant and diverse at both sites, but the legumes at these sites fix at different rates. At Benning, about half of the individuals we sampled were nodulating and fixing nitrogen, but at Eglin, only 3% of the individuals that we sampled were nodulating and fixing nitrogen, leading to this really low rate. So in contrast, soil crusts fixed a modest amount of nitrogen, and asymbiotic fixers contributed a moderate amount at Benning. Interestingly, at Eglin, asymbiotic fixers contributed the most nitrogen to the ecosystem, and this is largely because the legumes were fixing so little. We looked for relationships between fire and nitrogen fixation in several ways, but we found one clear way where fire affected fixation, and it had to do with whether or not a plot had burned within the last year. So if it had burned in the last year, there was a higher rate of fixation, and this was true for both our plots at Benning and our plots at Eglin. So this suggests that fire induces a higher nitrogen demand for legumes, a higher demand than what can be supplied from the soil. Now notice also that the rates between these two sites differ by more than an order of magnitude. Looking at the results of our greenhouse study, we found strong evidence that phosphorus stimulates fixation. The addition of phosphorus caused legumes to invest more biomass into nodules, and phosphorus addition caused legumes to fix more nitrogen on a relative basis as well. And we saw this across all 7 of the species that we selected for our greenhouse study. In contrast to phosphorus, we saw that nitrogen addition generally suppresses fixation. And this is what you might expect, because nitrogen fixation is an energetically expensive process, and you'd expect plants to downregulate the symbiosis if soil nitrogen is readily available. So here we have the relative investment a plant makes in fixation across the 7 species that we studied. And where you see an asterisk, that denotes that the species significantly downregulated fixation with additions of nitrogen. So not all of the species responded in this way. And there was some variability across the species in the amount of fixation that they supported in general. So to summarize our greenhouse study, we saw that phosphorus was a strong controller of plant growth, investment in nodules, and investment in fixation. This suggests that soil phosphorus is controlling the amount of nitrogen that legumes can fix. We also saw that nitrogen addition can suppress fixation, although this was a species-dependent response. This finding is important because it indicates that under conditions of soil nitrogen richness, legumes may not be fixing nitrogen. In our field study, we saw a relatively similar response among legumes. So here we're looking at the frequency of nodulation. So 0.4 means 40% of the plants had nodules. And what we found is that across both of our sites, the addition of phosphorus stimulated nodulation. But we saw no difference between the nitrogen addition relative to the control. So in contrast to legumes, we saw no response of nutrients to the growth of longleaf pine. These are plots that fell along our stand age gradient and across both sites. So no apparent response of longleaf pine trees to the addition of nutrients. We next examined the relationships between ambient soil phosphorus and legume fixation. We saw a strong relationship between resin extractable soil phosphorus, and this is bioavailable phosphorus, and legume fixation. Now, interestingly, this pattern did not appear within sites, but if we examined all of our plots across both sites, we saw this strong correlation, as well as this separation between our plots that were at Benning versus Eglin. So at Eglin, soils have low phosphorus and low fixation, and at Benning, soils have higher phosphorus and higher fixation. So let's move now to the ecosystem nitrogen balance. And here we are surprised to find that it's not balanced. and that fire removes more nitrogen than fixation can replace on an annual basis. So here we have all of our plots grouped by stand ages just for the ease of visualization. And these red or these burgundy bars are negative, indicating nitrogen losses induced from fire. The positive green bars represent our estimates of fixation as well as additions of nitrogen coming from atmospheric deposition. And so what you see is that more nitrogen is lost from fire than comes in through fixation and deposition. But the extent of the imbalance is variable across plots. And this variability is due to differences in fire frequency across our plots, as well as how much nitrogen was contained in the fuels that burned. So this finding is perplexing. In fact, the main finding of our study leads us to a new question, which is, why is there a nitrogen imbalance? And we see two possible answers to this. The first is that fire is removing too much nitrogen, and this could be problematic and lead to a reduction in forest resiliency. A second possibility is that there's excess nitrogen in the ecosystem, and fixation rates are low because there is low demand. And what I want to do now is walk you through more of our findings that lend support to this latter possibility. So if fire removes more nitrogen than can be replenished by fixation, we'd expect to see a decline in nitrogen stocks over time. And we do. This is the total soil nitrogen stock, and it declines with stand age at both sites. But in spite of this, we see no indication that stand nitrogen demands, this is the nitrogen that's incorporated into the biomass of the trees, we see no evidence that this is dropping over time as well. So overstory nitrogen demand, again, it's the annual amount of nitrogen that's needed to support biomass growth. And we see this natural rise early in stand age, and this is when growth rates of trees are the highest. But at maturity, nitrogen demands level out rather than dropping. So nitrogen stocks do decline as a function of this nitrogen imbalance, but they don't decline low enough to reduce tree nitrogen uptake. In fact, we calculate that only 0.1% of the total nitrogen stock is lost per year due to this nitrogen imbalance. So this suggests to us that there's more nitrogen than is needed in this ecosystem. This could be due to the chronic nitrogen deposition, and or it could be the effect of prior land use. So a lot of our planted stands, in fact, most longleaf stands that are less than 25 years old, were planted, and they were previously an unburned mixed pine oak forest. And if these forests are unburned for a long period of time, nitrogen accumulates in the organic layer. If these areas are then converted into longleaf pine, the soil nitrogen stocks may remain unusually high until fire is able to burn off and remove that excess nitrogen. Also, mechanized site preparation, such as drum chopping, could add a huge pulse of organic matter at the point of stand initiation. And this pulse may be more significant in a sandy, oligotrophic ecosystem like longleaf pine than in other types of forests. So in support of this idea, we see really high rates of nitrogen mineralization in our longleaf pine stands. And this is the rate that microbes are releasing mineral nitrogen, which is then made available for plant uptake. Nitrogen mineralization rates we see are exceptionally high in these younger stands. Much higher rates than what you'd expect in a nitrogen-poor ecosystem that frequently burns. And at Benning, nitrogen mineralization reduces rapidly with stand age, while at Eglin it remains elevated. And what's really interesting is that it's at Eglin that legume nodulation is so low, so only 3% of the plants are fixing nitrogen. So it could be that high nitrogen availability is suppressing the legumes from fixing nitrogen. Another piece of evidence for our excess nitrogen hypothesis is that nitrogen fertilization did not stimulate the growth of longleaf pine trees. While it's possible our experiment wasn't long enough or it didn't dose enough nitrogen to the system, this isn't the only study to show a lack of response to fertilization. So this is suggesting that nitrogen is not limiting in our system. So given the support that we have for this excess nitrogen hypothesis, it's important to think about the role that fire plays in the ecosystem. So instead of thinking about fire as a process that removes too much nitrogen, it might be more appropriate to think about fire functioning as a release valve, allowing excess nitrogen to leave. Now the challenge is that this hypothesis is difficult to test explicitly. We would require a pristine longleaf pine stand with no prior land use legacy effects and no nitrogen deposition. But this finding also raises a possibility that longleaf pine are now persisting in a novel nitrogen environment. So that makes it difficult to assess the response of the nitrogen cycle to a historical fire regime. So at face value, for example, our study shows that historical fire regimes remove more nitrogen than can be replenished. But contemporary nitrogen fixation rates may not be the same as they were historically. In fact, we know that legumes reduce their fixation rates if soil nitrogen is sufficient. So instead of fire removing too much nitrogen, nitrogen fixers may not be fixing as much because they have plenty of nitrogen available in the soil. In terms of benefits to DoD, our work is useful to land managers because it suggests that longleaf pine are not nitrogen poor and that fire can be prescribed to meet management objectives without concern that it's removing too much nitrogen. So for example, management objectives relating to increasing diversity or ecosystem function, again, not being concerned that that fire is causing loss of resiliency to the ecosystem. In fact, it might be more appropriate to think about it in the opposite view, that we need to continue to prescribe fire in order to remove excess nitrogen. But it's also valuable to know that in spite of the nitrogen richness in the ecosystem, there are many nitrogen fixers. In fact, they're diverse. So these fixers are there ready to replenish nitrogen stocks if they do become too low. So for example, with the legumes, we know that these legumes have the ability to fix a lot of nitrogen if the conditions are right, like immediately after fire. So after a severe disturbance due to military training activities or timber harvest or land use change, if nitrogen does become severely limiting, it can be useful for managers to consider that these nitrogen fixers are a mechanism to replenish those losses. This work would not have been possible without the support and assistance of a number of individuals, and I don't have time to name all of them, but I want to point out that our work trained 12 students in field and lab techniques relating to forest ecology and biogeochemistry. This research project also supported and trained 4 graduate students, and 2 of these students earned master's degrees in ecology, and their thesis research was associated with this project. So with that, I think we have time to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Nina. And yes, we have time now for questions. So at this time, we encourage the audience to please submit your questions for Nina in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Nina, my first question is, in the context of nitrogen imbalance, are there any warning signs for a land manager that indicate too much nitrogen is leaving the system?
Yeah, that's a question that I've been thinking about. It's hard. The methods that we employed, it took years of measurement and seasonal measurements. It's not something that is practical for a land manager to do. So I think probably the best warning sign would be highly chlorotic plant tissue. So for example, longleaf pine with yellowing needles, really slow growth rates, that might be indicative that that nitrogen is severely limiting.
Okay, thank you. Are there negative impacts from excess nitrogen within the ecosystem?
Yeah, that is a great question. So in general, across terrestrial ecosystems, excess nitrogen can lead to acidification. It can lead to a suppression of diversity, and it can also lead to excess hydrologic losses of nitrogen that then can pollute freshwater systems and end up in our oceans and cause eutrophication. So excess nitrogen is definitely a problem, and it's not a problem that is unique to our longleaf pine system.
Understood. Thank you very much. If there are a lot of legumes in the longleaf stands that a manager oversees, how can that person know if they are fixing nitrogen?
Yeah, so it's actually it's not that difficult to know whether an individual plant is fixing nitrogen. It's more difficult to quantify the rate. But one telltale sign is if the root system contains nodules. And so if you were to dig up an individual plant and capture enough of the fine roots that are coming off of the taproots, I should mention that a lot of these legumes have really, really deep, weird-looking taproots that go, sometimes deeper than we can possibly dig. But most of the nodules that we have found occur within the top 20 centimeters of the soil. And so if you are interested to know if your legumes are actively fixing nitrogen, the easiest thing to do is to get a shovel and dig a couple up and see if they have nodules. And one of the things that we found in our work is that this rate of nodulation varies a lot across species. So certain species are just more likely to be fixing than others. So the species that are these creeping vines, like Mimosa quadrivalvis, for example, is one that is more likely to be nodulating than another species, like Tephrosia virginiana, for example.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is that you showed that the two sites, Benning and Eglin, are really different in their nitrogen fixation because of soil phosphorus. Is there a way to predict how other longleaf stands might compare to those two sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. Benning and Eglin fall on opposite ends of the coastal plain. So Benning is actually more along the fall line where the Piedmont transitions into the coastal plain, whereas Eglin is very close to the coast. And so the soil properties the weathering intensity is different, the parent materials are different. So even though these our studies were conducted on sandhill sites, the soils were similar in terms of their texture, but the phosphorus was very different. We think this relates to the amount of weathering intensity that's occurred over millennia. So this question about how might a land manager or how might an ecologist know if what sort of soil phosphorus is in their soil or what amount, it might be helpful to first consider the location of the site, the type of soil, and the parent material that underlies the site. My guess, just to make a sort of like a general statement, is that I'd expect soils closer to the coast, like closer to Eglin, to have lower phosphorus in them than those that are closer to the transition of the Piedmont, like Benning.
Okay, thank you. And just a follow-up question about the two sites. Are the soil pH values similar at both sites? And if not, could that have an impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the soil pH is low in both sites. I can't remember the values off the top of my head, but I could have those numbers at the question and answer session at the end. And my memory is that pH is lower at Eglin, and that could be a result of higher nitrogen in that system. But I can have a definite answer for you later on.
Okay, wonderful. Is there a quantified input of nitrogen from lightning, especially in the case of the Eglin site?
Yeah, that question has been raised to me before. Lightning strikes are a non-biological vector of nitrogen inputs to ecosystems, and there are a lot of lightning strikes at Eglin, but if you think about a given hectare and how infrequently lightning would strike in a given hectare, it's unlikely that lightning would be an important input of nitrogen to the ecosystem. That's not to say it's not important. It doesn't happen. It's just in comparison to something like biological nitrogen fixation, it should be pretty minimal.
Okay, thank you. We did receive a couple of questions about your slide number 30, which showed field results indicating the correlation of nitrogen fixation with soil phosphorus. What is the hypothesis behind that correlation?
The explanation, or the possible explanation there, is that the more phosphorus that is available to a nitrogen fixer, the more able that plant is to fix nitrogen. So nitrogen fixation is a very expensive process energetically. It requires a lot of ATP. And on top of that, as the nitrogen is fixed and is incorporated into the plant tissue, the plant needs to balance that stoichiometrically. It needs to balance the nitrogen that comes in with phosphorus. And so the phosphorus can't come out of the atmosphere. The phosphorus has to come from the soil. And so we've seen this in other ecosystems where just the ambient amount of soil phosphorus in the system really determines how much nitrogen the nitrogen fixers can fix.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nina. And to our audience, Nina will return at the end of the webinar to address more questions. So if you have additional questions for Nina, just note that in your question in the chat box. Now at this time, we'll move on to our second presentation of today by Dr. Joseph O'Brien. And Joe is a research ecologist and the fire team leader with the Center for Forest Disturbance Science of the United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service Southern Research Station in Athens, Georgia. And since joining the Forest Service in 2002, his research has centered on fire science, specifically the spatial interactions among wildland fuels, fire behavior, and fire effects. His graduate training and prior work experience gave him the expertise in plant ecophysiology, plant ecology, and forest management. He has worked as an ecologist in the southeastern United States for more than 30 years. Joe received his master's and doctoral degrees in biological sciences from Florida International University. Joe?
All right, thanks Jennifer, thanks for the intro, and thanks everybody for joining. Really fascinating presentation by Nina, my colleague, and let's get to it. So the main purpose for the SERDP project that I led that began in 2012 it was actually a three-pronged project where we were interested in exploiting ecological theory to try and answer some relevant management questions. That was one leg of the three-legged stool. The other two legs had to do with how do we actually capture the impact of management on the distribution of biological diversity, and specifically how do we best measure that biological diversity. And then finally, we wanted to find out if there were any new ways of measuring sort of the impact of management on diversity by exploring new kinds of diversity that haven't really been utilized much in the monitoring world. And then the overarching objective was to make all this theoretical work relevant to people on the ground managing the land. So what I'll do is I'll try to convince you that as a land manager, paying attention to theory can actually be useful. And one of the critical sort of questions you have to answer if you're going to try and maintain diversity as an ecosystem is you have to know how it works. What are the mechanisms that are maintaining diversity before you can really understand how your management interventions are going to influence the maintenance or the reduction or increase of that diversity and restoration. Next is how do you measure it? How do you capture it? What's the most efficient and cost-effective way? And then finally, I'm going to try and convince you that some of this theoretical work really did have some applied relevance. Finally, I'll end with where we're taking the results of this project. It was a 5-year project, began in 2012, it just ended. We're still producing knowledge from the work, and we will probably for some years to come. Brief background, I worked in the same system as Dr. Wurzburger described, but specifically I concentrated the work at Eglin Air Force Base in both sand hills, the more xeric sites, and in flatwoods, which are the more mesic sites. The reason why we chose Eglin Air Force Base specifically and Longleaf in general is that this ecosystem is really important for operations in a lot of the southeastern military bases. It covers a large proportion of many military ranges in the southeast. We specifically chose Eglin because it's a hotspot for the remaining cover of existing and, in fact, reference stand Longleaf. So in order to understand how a system works, it's best to focus on a system that hasn't been perturbed as much. We learned that there virtually isn't any ecosystem on the planet that hasn't been perturbed at some level by, for example, increased nitrogen deposition. But there are many stands at Longleaf that have had minimal impacts. And so we wanted to find out how those worked first. Why is this relevant to the Department of Defense? Well, a lot of the training activities and testing activities that occur in these bases require an intact ecosystem to work in. For example, in training, a lot of the exercises that were occurring at Eglin were done in the woods. And so balancing those activities with maintaining ecosystem function is important to maintain the long-term viability of these landscapes. Because there are laws of the land that we all have to follow, we also have to pay attention to what our activities are doing to the landscape, and monitoring is critical for that. And you want to find out how to most accurately and efficiently monitor your activities, and that was another big part of the relevance. And also we were interested in, are we really capturing the impacts of various activities, and do we need more sensitive metrics to see what these activities are actually doing to the ecosystem? So we divided sort of conceptually our project into these two realms, patterns and processes. So the patterns are looking at how species are distributed through space and time. This is important for looking at sort of landscape level health and stand level health, and really are going to be important in informing how to track changes in that diversity. And then secondly, the process part is what is driving those patterns? What are the actual mechanisms behind the structuring of the ecological communities that exist in this landscape? And this is where a lot of the theoretical work is. And some of the important work that is relevant to DoD is that we've discovered a really tight link between forest structure and some of the processes that pattern diversity. And forest structure is something that land managers all influence through their activities. Just a little bit of background, some indirect evidence for the excess nitrogen hypothesis is that if you take fire away from a longleaf pine ecosystem, basically the ecosystem will eventually collapse. It will turn into something else. So frequent fire has been shown to be critical for the maintenance of biological diversity and stand structure in longleaf pine ecosystems. And the interesting phenomena is that the more frequent the fire, the higher diversity. In fact, you can't burn it too frequently if you're looking to maximize diversity. Basically, you're burning it as often as the fuels will carry fire, and that you see the highest levels of plant diversity. And so prior research identified this relationship, and it appears across productivity gradients. So, your wet flatwoods and your dry sandhills both respond to frequent fire with higher diversity, but the mechanism was completely unknown. There's some hypotheses, but nobody had critically examined or experimentally tested some of these theories in a way that could give a convincing result. And so we began thinking about this project by thinking about the soils that Nina talked about. So at Eglin Air Force Base, especially in the sandhills, the substrate, the soils are essentially beach sand. Just imagine a play sandbox. And that's really what all these plants are growing in. All the diversity is partitioning itself in this really relatively uniform substrate. And the diversity that occurs in the frequently burned longleaf stands in the southeastern coastal plain are some of the highest at finest scale in the world. For example, there was a study that found 50 species of vascular plants in a 1 square meter plot. To pack that many species into such a uniform substrate really pushes sort of your credulity and niche partitioning theory, where what we all learned in undergraduate ecology is that these plants are partitioning the resources in that soil 350 different ways so they don't compete with each other. Well, I was skeptical that that was the process, the mechanism that was driving this diversity. And so this is where the theory comes in. So what is the theory? What is theory? Why do we use theory? Basically, we're trying to understand how nature functions, in this case a longleaf pine stand, mechanistically and also in testable ways. And so we sat down and we thought about, what are the ecological theories that are relevant to longleaf pine and that might explain this relationship between fire frequency and diversity. And the reason why we chose to focus on that aspect is that fire is one of the most important management tools. And so understanding the influence of fire on diversity was clearly a critical starting point for producing a relevant result. And the theory that we chose to sort of explore and exploit were theories related to community assembly, and then for the second part of the talk, how biological diversity is organized in time and space. And there's an old saw, there's nothing so practical as a good theory, and this is why sometimes this dichotomy between basic and applied research is artificial. Without good theory, we're not going to be able to guide good applied science. So without getting into the weeds too much on the theories and how the theories work that we talked about, and I would encourage, if you're really interested, first of all, ask a question at the end. Second of all, contact me or go to the SERDP website, and our final report is now available, and it's got a lot of details. But we decided to focus on this concept of neutrality in community assembly. What that means is that the way most people think about how organisms interact in nature is that they're competing for scarce resources, and the way the winners and losers are arranged determines how the community is composed. But there's other theories that say, well, competition doesn't really matter. You can model an ecosystem or a plant community or an animal community by just focusing on simple demographic parameters: birth, death, immigration, emigration, and at longer time intervals, speciation. This theory was called neutral theory, and it was originally proposed as an alternative hypothesis to more complex theories that a lot of people saw as arm waving. But we thought that the frequently burned longleaf pine ecosystem might be an actual representation of neutrality in nature, where neutral processes, these demographic processes, are what's structuring this really rich community. Now that's at one end of the spectrum. That's when you actually are having frequent fire. We all know that if you take fire out of a longleaf pine ecosystem, there are predictable changes. Neutral theory depends on sort of stochastic, random processes driving community assembly. But we know if we remove fire, there's predictable changes that happen. The oaks begin to dominate. The herbaceous and grassy species start to disappear. Fortunately, somebody created another theory that blends niche-based deterministic community assembly and the random stochastic neutral theory, and it's called the continuum hypothesis. And the work we did at Eglin really lent strong support to this particular theory. And once again, I won't go into some of the details because I don't have time, but we tracked plant and insect demography over time through more than 36 experimental burns using state-of-the-art technology on measuring fire energy release. So we have there's a lot of details in the methods that I can't get into, but trust me, the results strongly support the continuum hypothesis. Don't you love it when a scientist says, trust me? So let's get down into the mechanism that we propose is driving community assembly in longleaf pine. If you use thermal imagery, high-resolution infrared thermography, to map what happens during a fire in longleaf pine, you see that the distribution of energy release is not uniform. It is highly aggregated, especially the kinds of energy that can cause damage to plant tissue. This is a thermal image of pine cones burning underneath a longleaf pine. the amount of energy released by those glowing spots is sufficient to cause mortality of individual plants. So what we learned is that fire does two critical things. One, it levels the playing field. The pruning impact of fire has been likened to a grazer. The mowing of the above-ground biomass of the vegetation in longleaf tempers competition. It doesn't allow any one species to sort of dominate. So that's one important aspect of fire that drives community assembly and maintenance of communities. The dynamics that allows rare species to persist in these really rich, high diversity stands is not that limitation of competition. It's actually the mortality caused by this variable fire energy release. So the critical element of neutral theory is that you have a random element of death. Sounds horrible. But because the death of an individual species is not influenced by who that species is, it then removes any kind of competitive advantage that that species might have. And we've tested this explicitly with some cellular automata modeling and other analytical techniques, and it shows that yes, indeed, you can predict community assembly in a frequently burned longleaf stand without paying attention to any kind of aspects of the species. Just give them numbers. You don't even need to know what they are, and you can predict how the community will respond to fire. You take fire away, and it's almost instant that driver of diversity disappears. So what we learned in our investigation of the theoretical foundation of community assembly in longleaf is that the small-scale variability in fuels, which expresses itself in fire energy release, variability in fire energy release, is the critical element in maintaining high diversity when fire is frequent. When you remove fire, it almost instantaneously shifts to a deterministic niche-based competition model. And you can predict who the winners are going to be by focusing on certain traits. For instance, woody species are going to outcompete herbaceous species. Species with large below-ground tubers are going to outcompete species with fine fibrous roots. So all of a sudden you move from a system that's being maintained by a process that traits are irrelevant to almost within one burn, missing one burn, you shift to this dominance by competition community assembly. So that was pretty fascinating that it happened so quickly. We thought it would take much longer, but it turns out even within a burn, within an 18-month burn window, you start to shift towards competition at the end of that burn window. So the next burn bumps it back, but this relationship between fire energy release driven mortality disappears very quickly. So what we've been able to capture and explain fine-scale community assembly and community dynamics, and we've done this in a way that is pretty useful. We've used cellular automata modeling, which is a modeling technique that allows you to capture both spatial and temporal processes and predict outcomes. So that's all well and good if we're talking about trying to understand what's happening at the square decimeter scale or within a square yard for the non-metric users. So how do we make this relevant to a land manager? Well, fortunately, by connecting that really fine scale process to something that can be measured and modeled at coarser scales, namely the production of coarse woody debris and medium woody debris. I don't know what the word for medium coarseness is, but say 10-hour fuels, pine cones, branches. These are the fuels that are driving this heterogeneity and energy release that are structuring the community, and those are produced by trees. And so that was the natural next step to make this relevant to managers, is we can measure trees pretty well, and we can do this over broad scales. And since we know there's a production rate of cones and branches and needles, we can actually model the fuels over larger scales. And so that was another component of this mechanistic study, was to use LIDAR at multiple kinds of LIDAR, which is a way of mapping forests using either terrestrial or airborne sensors at very fine scales. We were able to recreate the entire Eglin landscape virtually using LIDAR, and by carefully measuring fuel production under different kinds of tree shapes and forms, we were able to parameterize a landscape scale fuel model. And that fuel simulation allows us to run fire models and then community assembly models. So this is what we're working towards. And this map of fuels over the entire Eglin landscape has had a spin-off. We all love spin-offs in science. And one of them is that because the stand map that we produced is so accurate and so fine scaled, in fact we can pick up trees as small as a few inches in diameter, it allows you to virtually cruise the entire landscape. You can actually do timber volume inventories using the LiDAR. So that means the foresters never have to leave the air conditioning, except maybe to validate a few of the LiDAR maps. Just kidding, just kidding. So the first part of my talk was focusing on the mechanisms driving one of the most important management tools, fire, in the Eglin landscape, and taking theory that may seem esoteric and making it applicable not only to understanding how fire works and understanding that frequent fire is important, but also understanding how forest structure interacts with this community assembly so that your stand dynamics and your stand structure, as influenced by, say, silviculture, are going to have a direct link to what happens on the ground in terms of plant biodiversity. So that's one leg of the three-legged stool. The second leg here is, okay, we know the mechanism, but how is that diversity distributed across the existing landscape outside of reference stands? So the Eglin landscape is diverse. It has plantations, it has stands that have burned regularly, stands that haven't burned regularly. We wanted to look at the distribution of diversity over that entire landscape, but first we had to figure out what's the best way and most accurate way to capture diversity. And we use theory to guide this research as well. There's a lot of theory on how diversity is partitioned through hierarchies of space and time. And so we use that theory to sort of explore, A, how is the diversity distributed? B, what are the impacts of different ways of sampling it on detecting and monitoring that diversity? And so when you think about how biodiversity changes in space and time, biodiversity changes at the very local level. Like if you're standing out in a longleaf stand, you look down at your feet and you see a bunch of little plants, that's the local level. That's sort of oftentimes referred to as alpha diversity. And then if you lift your head up and you look around at your local environment, say the stand that you're in that's received a certain particular management regime, that's known as beta diversity. And then the distribution of the different kinds of forests across the whole landscape is often described as gamma diversity or landscape level diversity. And understanding how the different kinds of species are distributed through that landscape and also through time since some disturbance is important to how to best capture your impacts and monitor your management. So let's dip into some of the results of this research. We both exploited existing monitoring data sets that Eglin Air Force Base has been collecting for several decades. And then we augmented them with a lot of additional field sampling. And there's a lot of work that went into this process that I'm glossing over. I urge people to take a look at that final report or contact me directly and we can chat about it more. But what this graph shows, and let me get the green arrow going here, this actually should say diversity on the y-axis. Shannon entropy, H prime, is an index of diversity, and I don't want to get into the weeds on what it actually means, but it's basically telling you if we know that there's a level of diversity out in the landscape and we sample it with a particular size or a particular number of plots, the diversity index gives us an idea of how it's changing, gives us an idea of how we're capturing that diversity. And so what we're looking for is where do we capture the highest H prime. And so our first level would be the local level within a plot, a 1 square meter plot. We see that we capture a fair amount of diversity at that very fine scale. And I mentioned before that longleaf pine is famous for having diversity at fine scale. So what that's saying is the majority of the diversity in the longleaf pine ecosystem is found at that local level. But if you start walking around a stand and you place more 1 square meter plots, your diversity peaks. So you capture the most diversity within a stand with multiple 1 square meter plots. Now, if you start scaling up to larger plots, the increase in diversity goes down. So this is an increase in diversity as well. So the diversity isn't disappearing, it's just the incremental change in the diversity you're capturing goes down. And this goes up to larger plots and then the entire landscape. So what the results of this shows that in longleaf pine flatwoods and longleaf sandhills, the majority of the diversity is found within a stand. And that to best monitor your activities, you need to focus on capturing the diversity within stands, not necessarily across the landscape or in large plots. You need relatively few small plots distributed among stands. And when I say stands, let's think about stands as a uniform sort of management regime. So you wouldn't want to put some in a reference stand, some in a new plantation, some in an old plantation. But the diversity within a new plantation is best captured by multiple small plots within a stand. I hope that's clear. So we know that we need small plots. So how many do we actually need? We know that small plots scattered within a stand do the best job of capturing plant diversity. So how do we know how many we actually need to do? And this is this is where people really want to know the answer. Like, how many of these darn plots do I have to do? Well, this is a result of some modeling we did with species richness and sample size based on collected data and then using some resampling techniques. What the results showed was that about 50 plots scattered among representative management units or representative habitats will capture the majority of like 80 to 90% of your diversity. And so another critical aspect of monitoring is, when do you do it? When's the best time to monitor? So we know that plants appear and disappear with the seasons. And so we analyzed that as well. And what we found in terms of the most important management intervention in a longleaf, you have to sample about 8 weeks after a fire, 6 to 8 weeks after a fire, to capture the diversity that's representative on that site. So you need about 50 plots scattered around the stand if you want to capture the vast majority of the diversity, and you want to sample them about 2.5 months after a fire. The timing of the sampling needs to coincide with the phenological responses of the plants as well. And we found that by focusing on our sampling in August and September, we would capture the vast majority of the species. We do miss some of the spring ephemerals, but the majority of the species are captured if you measure your plots in the early fall. So that was all relevant to plants. What about other elements of diversity? And one of the least inventoried and one of the most interesting elements of diversity in the longleaf are insects, and they're important for other guilds too, like red-cockaded woodpecker and other birds that eat insects, but they're interesting in and of themselves. So we applied the same kind of analytical process to insect sampling, and we found that the scale was somewhat coarser. You needed a slightly larger plot to capture the insect diversity, but it was still distributed relatively the same. And that makes sense, because most insect communities are structured around the plants that they feed on, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And if we think about the timing or how long an insect community takes to sort of recover after a burn, the interesting thing is around a year after a burn, the pre-fire insect community has reestablished itself. And like I said, I won't spend a lot of time on the details of this. This is an ordination of the different guilds, predators, parasitoids, and herbivores. They all seem to respond relatively similarly. The final thing I'll talk about with regard to new kinds of metrics of diversity that might be useful for monitoring management impacts, I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept called interaction diversity. So if you think about how a forest or any ecosystem functions, you know that there's primary producers, there's herbivores, and then there's predators. And you can think about how these different trophic levels interact by a network, in a sense. It's like a, I don't know, I guess it would be your friend on Facebook or something like that. But the complexity of the interactions can be captured by building a network that looks at the relationships between each individual species what trophic level it's in and who's interacting with it either as a predator, herbivore, or even hyperpredator. Because there are so many interactions, these interactions are very sensitive to the removal of an individual species, for example. So if one species drops out, it's going to have a ripple effect through the network. And that's why it's useful as a more sensitive indicator of monitoring, or for monitoring management impacts. Here's an example of a network of interaction diversity that was constructed at Eglin. And so at the bottom level, you have different plant species. The second tier, the first consumer trophic level would be the herbivores, in this case mostly caterpillars. And then the predators, in this case parasitoid wasps. You see that there's this really rich network of interactions. And then you can explore what would happen to the complexity of this interaction, both through time and through different kinds of management. And we're still working on some of this data right now. We have a publication in press right now, or I mean in review right now, that examines sort of the utility of this approach. But the neat thing about this approach is it actually can be sampled relatively easily. And although it requires a certain level of taxonomic expertise, relatively few plots can capture these really complicated sort of interaction networks. So it is a more sensitive metric of diversity. It's feasible to sample it. And we've learned some interesting aspects about it by sampling across time and through space. So where do we go from here? So we've just had a paper accepted for publication where we describe exactly what the pros and cons of different monitoring strategies are. But, you know, the monitoring strategies are just the beginning. So that, you know, we're able to provide information that will make monitoring more effective and more efficient. But we've also built the framework for a mechanistic understanding about how fire, silviculture, structure the longleaf plant community. And the next step is to connect this to other kinds of models like fire behavior models, where we'll be able to build a very rich modeling environment where we'll be able to manipulate stand structure, fuel distribution, and then run a fire through this landscape, which will tell us what that fire is going to do, not only in terms of fire energy release and fire behavior, smoke production, but also what it's going to do to the biological diversity in the stand. So it's going to be you know, we feel it's going to be a real game changer in terms of a modeling environment that people will be able to explore management scenarios and their impacts. And so this model, why the framework is so, I think it's so interesting and so powerful is that we've got built in this cross-scale, both in terms of time and space, foundation to build upon. So we've made this connection mechanistically between a landscape level process, forest structure, stand level dynamics of how fuels are distributed, how fire energy release at very fine scales then feeds back into how the plant community assembles, which includes the trees themselves. So we've built this sort of, it's like if you build it, they will come. And now we're trying to integrate the next levels and the other important kinds of models, specifically fire behavior models that will work in this framework. So in conclusion, one of the things that we've learned is that frequent fire and heterogeneous fuels are critical for maintaining diversity. And the heterogeneous fuels that matter are those that are derived from pine trees, the woody fuels specifically. We know that the mechanisms are there, and we understand the mechanisms that as always, it's more complicated than just a simple neutral or a simple niche model. It's actually this continuum, but we feel like we have a pretty good, solid understanding of the actual drivers of diversity. And understanding those drivers, if you know how the car works, you can fix it if it's not running right. We've also identified how to best capture diversity, both in terms of traditional metrics of diversity, plant and insect species richness, for example, and we've identified a new, more sensitive metric of diversity in terms of interaction diversity in these diversity networks. And they're all feasible. They're actually, we were able to streamline Eglin's monitoring program by sort of a strategic targeting of effort rather than just the broadcast blanket approach to trying to collect as much data as you can. And so I'll conclude there. I hope I have enough time for questions. I hope it didn't go too long. But thanks for having me. And of course, I forgot my acknowledgement slide, but I have co-PIs and colleagues, Andy Hudak, Louise Loudermilk, Lee Dyer, Jane Dell, Scott Pokswinski, Ben Hornsby, and of course, I have to give a memorial sort of acknowledgement to Bob Mitchell, who was one of the intellectual giants who helped us think through this original proposal and was there for about half the project, but we lost a few years ago. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for a very fascinating presentation. And we do have time for questions. We've received a couple of questions, and again, we encourage our audience to submit more using the chat box. Joe, your theory implies that small fire hotspots maintain diversity in the plant community. Did you consider testing this theory by removing pine cones from an area and monitoring diversity over multiple fires?
Yes, we did. We did exactly that. We had plots with no cones or uniform fine fields. We had plots with 5 cones, 10 cones, yes, and we monitored them through 3 fires. So yes, we did do that, and it's being written up as we speak. Some of it's been published already as well, and I can provide the references. But yes, we did do that. We experimentally manipulated the mechanism that we thought was driving the process. And that's where we sort of built our understanding that the deviation from neutrality occurred almost immediately with the removal of fires. So we also had plots where we actually didn't burn them as well. So yes, I apologize for not going into the details of the methods, but I was hoping to focus more on the results, and I would encourage anyone who wants to look at the details, go to that final report or contact me.
Okay, wonderful. Have these developments in theory and observations, particularly with respect to the fire disturbance recovery response, been used to confront ecosystem demography model results?
Ecosystem, well, yes, yeah. In the sense of have we tried to use this information to model whole forest sort of stand dynamics? Is that the question? I'm not sure I understand exactly what's meant by ecosystem demography model results. But we've used some of these demographic parameters to construct models. And also, Louise Loudermilk, one of my colleagues, has spent her dissertation sort of looking at longleaf stand development models, and we've been able to use some of this information to examine stand dynamics through that lens. If that's the answer I'm giving you, I'm not sure I'm right in getting to your question.
Yep. Yes, that was the question. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yes, we have, and we're still exploring it too. But it's there's a lot more to do, and especially in other ecosystems. We're interested in seeing how these patterns might play out in ecosystems with similar structure, ponderosa pine, for example, and other sort of frequently burned coniferous ecosystems. But it's given us a good place to start.
Great, thank you. How would you manage trees through silviculture to maximize diversity? So
that's a really good question, because really the results of a lot of this reinforce some of the observations of the fire ecology pioneer Herbert Stoddard, and some of the silviculture that he developed, Stoddard-Neal approach, sort of single tree selection. So basically, if you think about how the diversity is distributed, it's very fine scale diversity, and the patterns that are maintaining that diversity are also fine scale. Distributions of individual cones, for example, are critical for maintaining the demographic parameters that drive that community assembly. So if you start manipulating forest structure by removing trees over larger areas, you're likely going to disrupt that mechanism that maintains diversity at that highest level. So distributed sort of fine scale disturbances would probably be more compatible with maintenance of high diversity than larger scale interventions would be what I would argue. So going back to the master Herbert Stoddard and Leon Neal's approach would probably maintain your highest diversity.
Okay, thank you. Are there other major perturbations to this ecosystem that match or exceed the scale of fire that are also important to consider?
Absolutely, and that's something we hope to explore. And you know, at a military base, there's obviously large disturbances that occur, and we were interested in sort of different shapes of disturbances even. So for instance, tank tread tracks or craters of different sizes, which often occur on military bases, but also, you know, the impacts of silviculture. Other people have started to look at this, but not through the lens of these mechanisms that we've identified. So we could actually, you know, we wrote a white paper on this actually for SERDP where, you know, we think that traits are going to matter in disturbances that are larger than sort of a critical minimum size. And so the whole neutral process that maintains this high diversity at the finest scales is going to fall apart immediately if you have a disturbance that's larger than, say, a few square meters. And modeling how those areas recover by looking at sort of the demography that might occur from the edges or the community assembly that would occur from the edges is something we really want to do. So we're interested in that and we want to pursue it.
Okay, wonderful. We have two more questions for you, Joe. The first is,
okay.
How would your monitoring findings be applied elsewhere to optimize a monitoring program?
Sure. I would argue that if it was a site that was occupied by Longleaf, you could basically focus on stratifying your monitoring efforts at the stand level, as long as those stands it's a stratified sort of sampling strategy where, you know, you want to sample plots distributed among a similar management regime. If it wasn't Longleaf, the critical thing to determine before you start monitoring is how is the diversity distributed. If your diversity is distributed at coarser scales, you clearly need to tweak your monitoring so you capture the diversity over the appropriate scale. So in the case of Longleaf, it was within stand among plot diversity was where the rubber hit the road. Another system, it might be you really need to focus on landscape scale diversity or cross-habitat scale diversity. So the first thing to do is do a sort of a pilot study where you're going to, you know, determine the hierarchy of how diversity is distributed. That's what I would do.
Okay, thank you. Are the forest LiDAR models applicable outside of Eglin?
Yeah. So they were developed. So these models use the LiDAR gives you basically a cloud of points with a coordinate, you know, X, Y, Z. And to create a stand map, you have to take what is essentially just a cloud of individual points and construct a model that will recreate a forest. And so it took a lot of effort from Andy Hudak and Carlos Silva to create the stand model from that point cloud at Eglin. But the thing is, we've started testing it at other Longleaf sites. We haven't moved too far beyond Longleaf at this point. We may have tested it in a couple of loblolly stands, but it does appear like it's robust enough to cross productivity gradients in Longleaf anyway. So we tested it at an old growth stand, the Greenwood Plantation, and it worked really well. As a matter of fact, the LiDAR inventory was superior to the actual physical inventory. It was more accurate. So yes, it is applicable across multiple forest types, I believe, at least in Longleaf.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Joe. At this time, we'd like to bring back our other speaker, Nina. And before we go to just a couple of broader questions for both Nina and Joe, Nina, did you want to follow up on the pH values for the two sites, or follow up on that after?
Oh, I was wrong. Soil pH is actually not different between Benning and Eglin across our plots. So the value is about 5.2, so it's definitely on the acidic side. And we also conducted a greenhouse experiment where we took soils soils from Benning and soils from Eglin and grew our experimental legume plants and treated them with nutrients. And in that setting, in that greenhouse setting, the Eglin soils had a lower pH to start with. Not sure why that is, but across all of our plots, they had the same value.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And now for a question for both of our speakers, or I'm interested in both of your thoughts. We saw today that frequent fire is important for promoting diversity, and fire is also important for removing excess nitrogen. So is there a link between diversity and nitrogen at all? And Nina, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think it's likely that there are many reasons why fire promotes diversity, and I'm sure Joe will be more than happy to talk about that. But one reason in particular could be related to the nitrogen environment that fires promote. So if you imagine a case where nitrogen becomes really abundant, it could eventually lead to the dominance of a particular species that tends to grow really fast under high nitrogen, and that would outcompete the species that are more rare. And so it seems to me that maybe the next question might be, why fire is known to promote diversity, especially at these small scales that Joe was talking about, and how much of that is related to the dynamics of nutrients that we know to affect plant growth and competition among species.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Nina says. So the essence of what we found was that when you sort of move away from a competitive-based outcome, you have higher diversity, and the fire allows that to happen because it's got this stochastic element of mortality. As soon as traits begin to matter, then you immediately start losing some of the diversity. And that's what we saw in our fire exclusion plots and the plots where we removed the variability of fire energy release. It's exactly like one of the fundamental, I guess, processes that fire accomplishes is sort of the tempering of competition. And anything that destabilizes that, for example, exactly what Nina said, if some species do better under higher nitrogen and they can recover faster and they can shade out their competitors quicker, even before the next fire, that's going to have a negative impact on diversity. And, there's just this, and Nina can talk to this too as well, there seems to be just a general pattern across biomes where oligotrophic systems often have very high diversity. And people have been struggling to explain why that is, and we don't have the answer completely, and that was actually where neutral theory was born. But there is that general trend, coral reefs, longleaf pine, a lot of tropical forest ecosystems, the highest diversity is in some of these really poor, nutrient-poor systems.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because the analog in, say, a tropical rainforest of fire is leaching losses. And so tropical forests maintain high diversity. They're also known to sort of pump nitrogen out of the system, but instead of through volatilization from fire, it's leaching losses through the soil that end up in the streams. So interesting.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. Yeah, I think we haven't, I'm acting like I answered all the questions, but clearly we haven't.
That was really interesting. Thank you both. And we're reaching the end of our webinar time today. I'd like to ask each of our presenters what the last message that you'd like to leave the audience with is today. So Nina, we'll start again with you.
Oh man, now I'm under pressure. I would say the main message of our work was a surprise, and that was that nitrogen may not be as limiting as we thought, given the frequency of fire in these systems, and that we need to think about fire in a different way and thinking about fire as a way to get extra nitrogen out of the ecosystem.
Okay, wonderful. And Joe?
That's an awesome question to give us right 5 minutes before the end. Just kidding. No, actually for me, I would argue too that we need to think about fire differently. We need to think about it in a more sophisticated way than just, setting a fire across the landscape. It looks orange, it's all black, it did its job. I think we need to start understanding the within fire heterogeneity, and that's something that we haven't been able to do before relatively recently. Without the technology that we use to measure fire energy release with the thermal imagery, we would have never known that there was this pattern of heating caused by the different fuels that then subsequently led to different, mortality patterns. So I think an appreciation of how complex fire is goes hand in hand with an appreciation of how critical it is and how you need to maintain high fire frequencies if you want to have high biodiversity.
Great. Excellent last messages. Thank you to both of our presenters today for the very interesting talks and also for answering the questions. And our next webinar in this series is on Thursday, October 4th. It will be an overview of the SERDP and ESTCP Chlorinated Solvents Workshop and feature projects. Dr. Andrea Leeson of SERDP and ESTCP and Evan Cox of Geosyntech will be the presenters. And registration is already open for this and other webinars, so please visit the webinar webpage to register. And before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it if you would please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you.